The screaming started before dawn, not the kind of scream born of pain that comes later, but the low, trembling roar of 50,000 throats waking in unison. A hunger echoing through stone. If you click this, then you already know. This is not a story about Rome's glory, it's about what that glory cost. I remember the first time I walked beneath the Colosseum's arches. The air still held a metallic tang, as if the stones themselves remembered the taste of blood. You can almost hear it when you stand still. The shuffle of sandals on sand, the hush before spectacle. The collective breath of an empire about to watch someone die for joy. This was Rome, a civilization that called itself eternal, yet built its immortality on the slow choreography of suffering. Right then, let's go back to the heart of it. The games, not the polished, sanitized image of gladiators you've seen in films, but the real ones, the brutal games that shocked even the ancients themselves. Because beneath every cheer, there was a whisper, and beneath every whisper, fear. Imagine, if you can, the year 80 C. The air smells of incense, oil, and sweat. Emperor Titus has just opened his new masterpiece, the Flavian Amphitheater. A monument so vast that Rome herself seems to lean toward it. The people call it the Colosseum, though not yet for the reasons we do. Titus wanted to baptize his empire's stone beast with blood. He ordered 100 days of games, a festival of death dressed as divinity. Animals from every corner of the known world were dragged to Rome. Lions from Numidia, elephants from Africa, leopards from Anatolia. They came in chains, half mad from the journey, only to be released into a sandpit designed for slaughter. But it wasn't enough to kill. Rome demanded creativity. The games weren't merely executions, they were stories, and the victims, unwilling actors. It begins with a hush, the crowd waiting, the emperor watching. Two men step into the arena. They bow to Caesar, whispering the words, Ave, Caesar morituri te salutant. Hail, Caesar, we who are about to die salute you. It sounds noble, doesn't it? Almost poetic, but most of them never said it. That line was invented centuries later. A historian's desperate attempt to make death sound dignified. The truth, gladiators were slaves, convicts, the disposable men of empire. They were trained in schools called ludi, brutal barracks where discipline was kept with whips and fear. They slept in chains and were branded like cattle. But out there, on the sand, they became gods for a heartbeat. Some fought for survival, others, for fame, a strange kind of immortality. Because in Rome, death was not the opposite of glory, it was its final proof. When the first blade struck flesh, the crowd erupted like thunder rolling through marble. Every gasp, every cheer, every plea, Rome fed on it. But the Colosseum wasn't always dry. Titus had a mad idea. To flood his arena and turn it into an ocean. They called it the Naumachia. A mock naval battle fought by prisoners and slaves. On actual ships, in an arena filled with water. You might think it impossible, but Roman engineers were geniuses of both creation and cruelty. They built watertight gates, flooded the pit with aqueduct water, and unleashed miniature fleets to wage war before a roaring crowd. Imagine the madness of it. Hundreds of men chained to sinking vessels, fighting on command while the emperor watched from shade. Wine in hand, to die in battle was honorable. To die drowning for entertainment, that was Rome's idea of pageantry. By the 2nd century, Rome's bloodlust had evolved into something almost ritualistic. They called it Venatio, the great beast hunts. At dawn, cages creaked open beneath the arena floor. Lions, bears, tigers, even crocodiles. Unleashed against hunters known as bestiarii, but not all who entered were armed. Sometimes, the condemned were thrown in naked, with only a spear and a prayer. To the crowd, this was theater. To the condemned, it was hell. The sand soaked up so much blood that it had to be replaced daily. Historians wrote that during one festival, over 9,000 animals were slaughtered, 9,000 living creatures. Just to remind the world that Rome could command nature itself. They called it civilization. But I reckon even the gods must have turned their faces away that day. What fascinates me most isn't the violence itself. It's the psychology behind it, the way cruelty was dressed as order. Rome prided itself on law, on discipline, on virtue. And yet, beneath the marble and rhetoric, there was an obsession with watching power made visible. Every strike, every cry, every fall, was a performance of hierarchy. The emperor's smile mattered more than 1,000 lives. Because if he smiled, Rome believed itself just. When the crowd chanted mit, or jugula, spare him, or kill him, they weren't merely spectators, they were complicit authors in the empire's script. And the emperors, from Commodus to Caligula, knew that the games were not just entertainment, they were control. I often wonder what the air must have felt like after. When the crowds dispersed, when the sand was swept, when silence finally crept back through the arches. Imagine walking across that arena at dusk. The ground sticky with blood, the scent of iron thick enough to taste. A slave dragging a corpse by the ankles, a priest whispering a blessing that no one would remember. That silence, that was Rome's true legacy. Because beneath the splendor, beneath the propaganda of empire, there was always that pause. The collective inhale before the next scream. The games would grow crueler still, in the centuries to come. They would turn execution into theater, myth into murder, and death into an art form. And the people would cheer, until they forgot why they were cheering at all. When the sun rose over Rome, it didn't bring warmth, it brought expectation. The people gathered not for worship, but for spectacle. And in that, Rome was consistent. Its gods were many, but its appetite for cruelty was singular. By the 2nd century, the empire had perfected its most perverse invention, execution as entertainment. To them, death wasn't a punishment, it was a performance. And the stage, the Colosseum, glinting like a chalice of blood under the Italian sky. You think you've seen horror in films, the screams, the close-ups, the slow motion of agony. But here, in this place, no camera lens was needed. Only the human eye, and the willingness to look. The crowd would murmur before the gates opened, their voices rising like a storm over still water. Below the arena floor, in the dim tunnels called the hypogeum, men waited, criminals, rebels, slaves trembling in the dark. They could hear the growls, they could smell the musk of fur and blood. When the gate lifted, daylight hit them like fire, and then came the sound. The kind of roar that doesn't echo in your ears but in your bones. From the shadows, the beasts emerged, lions, leopards, bears, each starved, teased, and trained to recognize the human figure as prey. The condemned weren't always guilty of anything at all. Sometimes they were Christians, sometimes foreigners. Sometimes just poor souls chosen to fill the schedule. Rome called it justice. But it was never about justice, it was about rhythm. A choreography of chaos designed to keep the empire entertained. Some died instantly, others lasted minutes that felt like eternities. A few, maddened by terror, ran toward the beasts instead of away, seeking a faster end, and when it was over, the crowd would cheer, and the sand would drink. I often wonder, who cleaned the arena afterward? Who washed the stones, buried the bones, reset the stage for the next act? There were slaves for that, too, nameless, silent, and unseen. Even death had a hierarchy in Rome. Rome prided itself on order, but its punishments were performances designed to remind the masses what defiance would cost. One of the most dreaded spectacles was crucifixion. Contrary to popular belief, it wasn't reserved for heretics or messiahs alone. It was standard procedure for slaves and rebels. Crucifixion wasn't swift, it was slow theater. A cruel innovation of visibility. Victims were placed on public roads, so travelers could see them twisting in the sun. Their suffering wasn't private pain, it was civic education. The empire whispered, obey, and you'll live. Disobey, and you'll decorate the skyline. Sometimes, crucifixions were paired with animal hunts. The condemned strung up as bait, while leopards clawed at the posts below. A warning and an amusement, wrapped in one. Even Roman philosophers, men like Seneca and Cicero, recorded the horror with detached admiration. As if cruelty, when done efficiently, became a kind of artistry. Discipline, they called it, but it was discipline that fed on its own reflection. If the Colosseum was the people's theater, then the palaces were the emperor's private stage. Emperors like Caligula, Commodus, and Domitian took the games and twisted them into personal fantasies of domination. They didn't just watch death, they directed it. Caligula, the mad one, was said to have forced nobles to fight as gladiators, their polished hands gripping swords for the first and last time. He allegedly emptied the treasury to fund games that lasted weeks. And when he ran out of criminals, he ordered random spectators to be thrown into the arena instead. Imagine that, one moment you're applauding, the next you're part of the entertainment. Commodus was worse in his vanity. He fancied himself a demigod, the reincarnation of Hercules. He would stride into the arena dressed in lion skins, brandishing a club, demanding the crowd worship his divinity. But he cheated always. He'd fight tethered beasts or unarmed men, and call it heroism. When the Senate protested his charade, he simply executed the loudest voices and carried on. The crowd still cheered, because in Rome, applause was survival. Not all Roman games took place before roaring crowds. Some were hidden, quieter, colder. They called them ludi gladiatori. Gladiator schools, though school feels too kind a word. These were prisons with choreography. Men were trained to kill as others learned to paint or sing, with repetition, precision, and punishment. One of the largest, Ludus Magnus, sat right beside the Colosseum. You could walk from one to the other through an underground corridor, a direct passage from training to death. The men inside were fed just enough to survive, their bodies sculpted by cruelty into spectacle. Sometimes, the trainers, Leniste, would pit pupils against one another in mock duels. Whoever failed to perform convincingly was flogged, starved, or replaced. There's a strange kind of poetry in that, isn't there? Rome perfected death the way others perfected art. I once read that some gladiators grew to love the cheers, to crave the rush of the crowd's roar more than life itself. That's what Rome did best. It didn't just kill the body, it reprogrammed the soul. Every so often, a defeated fighter would raise a trembling hand, a plea for mercy. The emperor would gesture, thumb turned up or down. It's become legend, but the truth is more complicated. Historians debate whether the thumb meant life or death, but the symbolism remained the same, a man's fate decided by gesture. Sometimes the emperor spared them, not out of kindness, but to prolong the game. A crowd could love a survivor almost as much as a martyr. The spectacle thrived on contrast. Hope dangled, then crushed. That was Rome's genius. Even compassion became part of the show. There's a passage by the historian Cassius Dio that haunts me whenever I read it. He described a moment when, after a particularly violent show, the crowd fell into an uneasy silence. He wrote, even the people seemed ashamed of their pleasure. For one fleeting instant, the mask slipped. They saw what they were, an empire addicted to pain, disguising horror as harmony. but the silence never lasted, because shame, like mercy, was just another intermission. Between one scream and the next, the empire would grow still more theatrical in its cruelty. In time, myth itself would be rewritten into blood. Stories of gods reenacted with human sacrifices. Dramas so grand they blurred the line between ritual and murder. And the people would call it culture. I sometimes think the most dangerous thing Rome ever built wasn't the Colosseum, it was the stage inside the Roman mind. The conviction that death could be meaningful, if only it was beautiful enough. By the 3rd century, that belief had devoured the Republic's old conscience. What began as civic ritual became theater. What began as punishment became art. And art, in Rome, was spectacle. Every story the poets told, of Jupiter, Mars, Venus, or Vulcan, could be bought, rehearsed, and bled into the sand. They called them mythic reenactments. I call them plays that lied about their endings. You'd recognize the tales: Orpheus charming the beasts, Prometheus chained for stealing fire, Icarus falling from the sky. Except in Rome's version, there was no trick, no illusion. A condemned man was Prometheus, he was chained to a post. And when the vultures came, they weren't props. To a Roman audience, these stories were morality made flesh. Each death reminded them that defiance was divine but costly. The crowd would weep and cheer in the same breath. Believing they were watching myth, not murder, the emperors loved this. They fancied themselves as gods directing their own creation myths. Domitian once staged a rebirth of Venus, where a woman was lowered naked into a pool of perfumes, and never came back up. To him, it was symbolism. To her, it was the end. Rome blurred fiction and punishment until the difference ceased to matter. And the spectators, perhaps out of self-defense, pretended not to notice. You might ask, how could they watch? But I reckon that's the wrong question. The real puzzle is how they believed. Rome convinced itself that these deaths purified the city. Each drop of blood was payment, for peace, for harvest, for victory abroad. It was civic superstition in marble armor. The philosopher Seneca once warned that the games were a school for cruelty. But by then, the lesson had already been learned. Children grew up reciting the names of famous gladiators, as others recited heroes or saints. Merchants sold oil vials carved with scenes of execution. Tourists bought tokens stamped with the Colosseum's facade. Death had become the empire's merchandise. And then, one day, I realized the 9th game was never listed. Because it wasn't a contest fought on the sand, it was fought in the stands. The crowd was Rome's most dangerous invention. A living organism made of flesh and frenzy. When 50,000 people scream for blood, it stops being entertainment, it becomes worship. I've stood where they once sat, the marble benches polished smooth by generations of bodies. Close your eyes and you can still feel it. That low vibration of hunger disguised as joy. They weren't monsters, those spectators. They were human, that's the most terrifying part. They came to forget their poverty, their hunger, their powerlessness. And in that forgetting, they became part of the machinery that crushed them. Bread and circuses, the poet Juvenal called it. Keep the people fed, keep them distracted. And they'll never ask who's steering the ship. Sound familiar? Every empire, old or modern, learns the same trick. When I imagine the final days of the games, the crumbling empire, the emptying coffers, the restless provinces, I picture the arena standing half abandoned. The sand dry, the tunnels quiet, a single gust of wind moves through the arches, carrying the ghosts of 10,000 cheers. And I swear, if you listen closely, you can still hear a rhythm, not quite a heartbeat, but close. Rome never stopped playing, it simply changed its instruments. The empire's end would come not with rebellion, but with exhaustion. The Christians would outlaw the games. The philosophers would call them barbaric. The senators, inconvenient, but the truth. Rome didn't end its games because it found morality. It ended them because it could no longer afford the tickets. Walk through any modern stadium at night, when the floodlights are off and the seats are empty. Listen carefully, you'll hear the same silence. The same anticipation for the next spectacle. The next face to rise and fall before a crowd's delight. History doesn't repeat, it rephrases. The costumes change, the rules evolve, but the hunger, that ancient, Roman hunger for spectacle, remains. We like to believe we're different, that we've learned. But whenever a crowd cheers a downfall, whenever misery becomes trending entertainment, I reckon we've just modernized the Colosseum. Sometimes, when I finish reading old accounts of the games, I catch myself closing the book too softly, as if afraid to wake something that's only sleeping. I think about the sand, about the men and women who stood upon it, and about the faces in the crowd, and I wonder if any one of them looked down at the arena floor and felt what you and I might feel now, that quiet, sickening awareness. That joy built on another's pain always carries a cost. Rome paid it, in the end. Every empire does. I've spent years chasing the ghosts of Rome. They live beneath the cobblestones, in broken marble faces half buried under dust, in the scent of old blood that still seems to cling to the air around the Colosseum after rain. Every time I walk those arches, I swear the air feels heavier. As if time itself remembers. You can almost taste the history, metallic, sharp, like the moment before a knife goes in. And sometimes I think, maybe Rome isn't gone, maybe it never left, maybe it just put on a suit, built glass towers, and renamed its arenas. Because if you look closely, if you truly listen, you'll still hear the roar, different language, same appetite. When the empire finally began to crumble, The games lingered like a disease that refused to die. Christian emperors condemned them, moralists called them pagan corruption, but the people still missed the noise. They didn't crave the killing, not exactly, they craved the certainty. The rhythm of the arena had given meaning to chaos. A world where the poor could watch the mighty fall. Where the condemned could rise, even for a heartbeat, as heroes. That illusion, that the spectacle was justice, was Rome's most brilliant lie. When I read the old chronicles, the lines written by dusty scribes who watched the last games fade into silence, there's something tragic about the tone. They sound almost bereaved, as if the end of the games wasn't relief, it was loss. You see, Rome didn't fear death, it worshipped it. They carved it into statues, painted it on walls, wrote poems to it. They called it honor, they dressed it in laurel wreaths and gave it applause. The games were never about cruelty alone. They were about the control of life itself. A reminder that in Rome, even death belonged to the state. When the emperor raised his thumb, he wasn't deciding fate, he was performing godhood. The audience was his congregation, the arena his altar. And those who died upon it were his proof of power. That's what made it so seductive. Because power, once sanctified by beauty, becomes irresistible. And once people learn to enjoy the spectacle of domination, there's no easy way back. Once, I stood in the center of the Colosseum at dusk. The tourists were gone, the guards were locking the outer gates, and the light was turning gold, that dying Roman gold that feels both sacred and exhausted. I closed my eyes, and I imagined the sand beneath my boots was still wet. The crowd above me, 50,000 strong. The sun burning through a haze of dust and smoke, the smell of sweat, iron fear, the drumbeat that starts slow, then faster, until it feels like your own heartbeat is syncing with the rhythm of death. Then, silence, because every crowd, eventually, goes quiet. In that silence, I understood something. Rome's arenas weren't designed merely for entertainment. They were built to train emotion, to teach people how to feel, how to cheer the unthinkable, how to confuse mercy with weakness, and cruelty with strength. It wasn't madness, it was method. And now, when I watch our own world, the endless spectacles, the televised humiliation, the obsession with downfall, I can't help but see Rome's reflection shimmering beneath the surface. We say we're civilicd. We say we've grown past blood and sand. But our colosseums glow with screens instead of torches. And our gladiators are destroyed not by lions, but by public opinion. Different weapons, same thirst. People love to watch others fall. It's a sickness buried deep in the species. A remnant of the crowd that once screamed for mercy to be denied. Rome didn't invent cruelty, it simply made it fashionable. And we've been dressing it in new clothes ever since. History likes to flatter itself with progress. But Rome's story teaches a quieter, darker truth. That civilization and savagery often share the same skin. It isn't technology that makes us humane, it's empathy. And empathy, my friends, is a fragile thing. It erodes easily. In laughter, in spectacle, in the thrill of watching someone else lose what you still have. That's what the Romans forgot. That's what destroyed them, not barbarians, not famine. But the rot that starts when a society begins to enjoy cruelty more than compassion. I still teach these stories. Students ask if I believe such horrors could ever return. And I tell them, they never left, they've just changed their choreography. Because human nature doesn't vanish. It adapts, and as long as there's an audience, there will be an arena. So next time you feel the pull of spectacle, when a scandal unfolds, or a life is torn apart in the public eye, pause. Listen to that ancient roar beneath the noise. Ask yourself whose sand you're standing on. If you're drawn to the shadows of history, to the stories that empires tried to bury beneath stone and silence, then you belong here. Subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me where in the world you're listening from. Because these echoes, from Rome, from Persia, from every empire that mistook spectacle for glory, they don't fade when we forget them. They fade only when we refuse to hear, so let's listen, together, before the next empire builds its stage.